What is up, guys? So today I'm going to be discussing a certain card that's been getting a bit of attention recently, and that's going to be Mystic Mine. So yeah, it was a video by DPYGO or DPOYGO. I can't remember how to spell his name, but yeah, definitely one of my favorite YouTube channels. And he was just talking about the notion that Mystic Mine is unfair, and yeah, I thought I'll throw my own 2 cents in as well. So I think I'll give a TLDR to start off with, just for those of you who really want to know my opinion. And my opinion is basically very similar to his. Essentially, the card is fair; it should be in the meta. Simple as. But let's look at that a bit more. So I'm going to start off by reading the card text. So it's a field spell, and it reads as following: if your opponent controls more monsters than you do, your opponent can't activate monster effects or declare an attack. If you control more monsters than your opponent does, you cannot activate monster effects or declare an attack. Once per turn during the end phase, if both players control the same number of monsters, destroy this card. So, Mystic Mine, wow. So, let's just look at the card in terms of its effect. We're going to remove the context in terms of the format and all of that and the different decks in the meta. And if you just look at the card kind of by itself, it looks quite balanced. I mean, whoever has more monsters essentially is locked out of monster effects, locked out of attacking, and the card nukes itself if you happen to balance that. So it kind of provides a lot of agency. You have natural agency by activating the card, but there's also a lot of agency for the person who doesn't activate it, because for example, if you have one monster and they have two, well, all they need to do is get rid of those two, consolidate them into one monster, and suddenly it's fair. It's a bit more difficult if you have no monsters, they have one, but even in a situation like that, if perhaps they're playing something that can destroy their own cards, or if they did something like summon another monster by tributing it and then summon their own, that's another way to out this card. It also pops itself in the end phase, so again, they can change their board and they can kind of play around it. It's a field spell, which means that you're not going to be activating this in activation to other things often. There are cards that allow you to sort of do that, like Metaverse and Demise of the Land, but generally speaking, if you've got this on your turn, you're activating it into a board full of negates or something. You're not just activating this willy-nilly. It's also a card that's pretty useless first turn, unless you happen to have a deck that can really effectively play around its self-destruction abilities. So that's the card just based on decks. Like it does look very balanced, but then when we kind of look at how the card's actually used, I think that's where the problems come in. And I think I've got 3 examples of how the cards are used, 3 main examples. So the first would be Skystrikers. I think Skystrikers is probably the biggest example of the problem with this card, and it really it's a similar situation to cards like Max C, Pot of Greed, Graceful Charity, and stuff like that. And it's the question of, why don't we have these really busted and polarizing cards? What's the problem with allowing these cards unbanned? And people often will think, oh, if we unban these cards, it'll be fine, because now the meta decks are put in check. The decks that special summon 15 times a turn are put in check now, because we have Max C, or every deck has Pot of Greed now. So now my deck, my Dark Lord deck, will be the strongest deck ever, because I have 2 free draws. But the issue you get is that when you unban or have these really busted cards, it's not just the bad decks that get access to this, it's the good decks that get access to this as well. And especially in the case of Mystic Mine, I think Skystrikers, especially the way they used to play Mystic Mine, and even the way they're playing it with it now, really is probably one of the most degenerate toxic things ever. Skystrikers is a really consistent deck. They were worse before with Engage and stuff, but even now they're still quite a strong deck. But they can essentially play Mystic Mine and play it in a way which it wasn't really intended for, at least as far as I can tell. They can activate Mystic Mine, ping you in the face of Hayate so you can't do anything, do pure damage, and then get rid of the Hayate if they want to as well, through a multitude of different ways. And they also have their own field spell that they can get rid of Mystic Mine whenever they want to OTK you. And so it means that they're able to play all the advantages of Mystic Mine, but none of the disadvantages, and it hasn't really equalized any game state, because Skystrikers was a strong deck. I mean, now they're not amazing in the meta, but before, when they were in the meta, they were playing Mystic Mine, and yet they were able to kind of utilize this almost balancing card, but not in a really effective way, not in a really fair way. Yeah, and I'll definitely say that's probably one of the biggest issues. That's one of the biggest issues with Mystic Mine, when a deck like Skystriker picks it up. But the second example of decks that use it is the Mystic Mine burn decks. Now, I actually don't think this is a huge issue. So if you look at Mystic Mine burn decks, we've only had a handful of toppings with this deck. A handful of tops with that deck. There's a couple of different variants. There's Final Countdown, there's Poison of the Old Man burn, there's just Goddess version where you just deck out your opponent. There's lots of different variants, but the general idea is you put Mystic Mine and then your opponent just doesn't do anything, and then you stop them from outing your Mystic Mine any means necessary, whether that's shuffling the top of their deck so they don't draw an out, dark bribing and soloing their negates so they can't get an out, putting tokens on their side of the field with a drama trio. There's loads of different ways, and you just really force your opponent to kind of not be able to use any monster effects, and it creates this game state where there's one of two scenarios: either they have the out or they don't. If they don't have the out, they instantly lose. If they do have the out, then depending on the variant and depending on what you have, you might be able to stop them. But yeah, that's the different variant. Now, in this second example, I don't actually see this as a huge issue. I don't think Mystic Mine burn decks aren't fun, but burn and store decks have a long time been a part of Yu-Gi-Oh! And even before Mystic Mine, they were in the game enough to be frustrating. I think Mystic Mine was definitely a big buff to them, but I think it's not unbalanced. It's unfun, but it's an unfun concept that's been in the game so long that I think blaming it on Mystic Mine, it's not fair. Mystic Mine really just leveled the playing field. It made the strategy maybe a bit better in some matchups. And it's, again, like I said, you're not seeing this top at a competitive level. If you try and take Mystic Mine burn to a tournament, you might sneak a win if you're lucky, but chances are you'll be out by like the third round. You'll taken a couple of losses, because what happens is in tournaments, firstly, people tend to side back row removal in. It puts back row removal in their side deck, and also you get a reputation as the Mystic Mine guy. You come to the table and people already know what kind of game you're playing. But yeah, I mean, so you'll sneak a lot of game ones, but then games 2 and 3 you just get dumpstered because people side in 3 evenly, 3 Storm, 3 Twisters, and suddenly you can't keep any back row on the field. So I actually have a video where literally that happened. I was against a Mystic Mine burn guy, and then I drew all 3 of my incredible outs and just completely nuked his board. And especially because if you're playing a Mystic Mine burn build, you're not going to be playing any monsters. You have no backup. If your Mystic Mine goes, a lot of the time you're completely screwed. So that's the second example, and I'll definitely say that's less of a problem. And then the third example is the most generic one, I'd say, and that's the sideboard. So you see a lot of people playing this card in their side deck, or maybe just playing it as a 1-of or 2-of in their deck, just as kind of like a counter to these 18, 20 negate boards. And again, I don't see this as a huge issue. So if we look at Adamantipator, for example, the boards that Adamantipator puts out are just really, really hard. I mean, they're going to have potentially like a Masquerainer, a Block Dragon that's going to recur resources, a Savage Dragon that's also going to lock out your opponent from the extra deck because of Buster Whelp. They might have an Appaloosa. I mean, the boards they put out are really, really crazy. They have Dragite as well, I even forgot about that, so they've got a Spell and Trap Negate. And so what this card allows you to do, I mean, firstly, you do have to have another card to bait out 1 or 2 negates sometimes, but this card essentially means that even though they have these crazy boards, it means that you can kind of slow down the game state and potentially counter them. And also, if you're playing a strategy that does need monsters, you will a lot of the time need to eventually get rid of the mine. So you do need kind of secondary things. It won't win you the game by itself, unless you're lucky enough that they're going to deck out because of it. But a lot of times it won't win you the game by itself, because you're going to need to firstly bait out a card with another card, and then you put Mystic Mine, and then you're probably going to need to clear their board. And all of these things together, I mean, a lot of things are going to need to add up to win you the game. So again, I don't see this as a huge issue. So I really only see the first example. Decks like Skystriker, really strong competitive decks using a card like Mystic Mine. That's the only time I really see it as a huge issue. But then let's look into countering Mystic Mine. So how do you deal with this card? So you have Twin Twisters, you have Heavy Dust Storm, you have Unending Nightmare, you have Evenly Matched, kind of. You have Lightning Storm, again, kind of. Those 2 cards are a bit conditional in their activation. You have the ability to potentially equalize the amount of monsters, so you could play something like Interrupted Kaiju Slumber if you're a deck that has Kaijus and give them a monster. You could, if you wanted to, play something like Ojama Trio and give them a monster. You could actually play a card like Set Rotation, for example, and just go straight over the mine. I mean, there are a couple of different ways to counter this card, but the issue really arises again in the situation where if they're a deck like Skystrikers, for example, chances are in game 1 you wouldn't have had a chance to do this because you weren't ready for it. You might have these back row removals, but you probably didn't have back row removal in your deck in the first place. But then games 2 and 3, even when you side in this back row removal, you have the issue of you might deal with the Mystic Mine, but you haven't dealt with the deck itself. You've now had to side in a lot of stuff just to deal with this card, and that creates a bit of an unhealthy game state where it's like, I now need to side in so many different things for a lot of these cards that just lock out the game. And by the way, Mystic Mine's effect is a really strong effect that when it's on monsters, in my opinion, it usually is deserving of instant ban. I think the two best examples recently are Utopic Zexal and True King of All Calamities. Denying your opponent from even activating monster effects, I think it's a really oppressive and unfair effect, and I don't think it should be in the game. Similarly, I don't think things like Buster Up should be in the game. Denying your opponent just from summoning from the extra deck, at least that easily, is unfair. I think Buster Up would be... I think the interaction between Buster Up and Union Carrier is unfair. I don't think either of the cards in themselves are unfair, and in their own decks they aren't unfair. But when you put them together and you have decks like Adamant's Pit that can easily generate resources to spit them both out, that's where I see the issue. But it's funny because that actually kind of goes into my next point, because I feel like the state of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is one which has forced a card like Mystic Mine to exist. So I remember when the Megatins were released, I think these are 2019 Megatins, and we had Nibiru, Dark Reader, No More, and Dimension Shifter. And when these cards were released, I'm a Dark Lord player, I love playing Dark Lords. And I found that the release of those cards really upset me, because they essentially solidified the... I mean, Dark Lords was never going to be meta. And a lot of other rogue players, we all need to accept, look, our decks were never going to be meta. But they help solidify the problem that your deck will never be meta. Because now suddenly, any board that you make can be instantly negated by Dark Ruler or instantly cleared by Nibiru. And Mystic Mine creates that exact same idea where it's like, no matter what you do almost, your board can be dealt with by Mystic Mine. But I mean, if you look on the flip side, I mean, when an Adamantipator player, when an Eldritch Synchro player puts down 18 different cards, they draw through half their deck in one turn, and they slapped, and then you just can't do anything. That's also not really a fun game state to deal with. And I do think Mystic Mine does a lot similar to Nibiru and Dark Ruler, which is why they're released, in terms of equalizing that. Because you have to remember, Konami is profit incentivized, and so power creep and the ability to do that, the ability to spam the board with monsters, is going to be something that they're going to keep releasing. And so I think Mystic Mine actually helps us more than it hurts us, because it means now that, especially if you're a smart deck builder, you can put 3 copies of Mystic Mine in your deck, go second against a deck like that with like Grim Marjorie, a really budget deck, and easily sneak a win against Adamantipator. It's not because you're playing incredibly well, but just because you had a smarter deck choice and because you have the option of doing that. And I also think one thing that a lot of players that don't like Mystic Mine forget is that it's not much different. If I have to sit down for 10 minutes and watch you combo for ages, or if I watch you cycle through 4 different cards, draw 4 cards off Crocosaurus and then calamities me, or you manage to put a Zexal down and then set 4 back row and then stop me from playing the game, it's not that much different to Mystic Mine. I think all of these are really kind of toxic and not fun game states that the game is kind of geared towards at the moment. And I think Mystic Mine is a necessary evil, at least. I don't know if it should be put to 1 or 2. The thing about that is, especially with cards like this, I think it doesn't do much. And I think the problem with when you start putting a card down to 2 or you put a card down to 1, you don't really change the problem with the card. It's only specific cards that I think should ever be limited and banned. Probably Destiny Hero Malicious is a good example, or cards that can loop. Things like that, I agree, they should be banned or limited. They should be limited or semi-limited. But I think a card like Mystic Mine, the problem with you banning it is it just becomes a luck situation. Have I drawn Mystic Mine or not? And you haven't really addressed the problem with the card. But yeah, I do think the card is fair. I do think it should exist. I think Dark Reader No More probably is in my opinion one of the best examples of a more balanced version. I think one of the things that makes it particularly fair is that Dark Reader No More can't be responded to by monsters. Similar to Mystic Mine, it kind of completely invalidates whatever monster they've done, but it can be responded to by spells and traps. But then there's another weakness Dark Reader has no more that Mystic Mine doesn't, and that's that it only lasts 1 turn. Mystic Mine does nuke itself in the end phase, but one thing that I would say that probably makes it most unfair is that it's a field spell, so it's gonna last. It's gonna stay there for as long as you want it to. And I think the ability for a player to kind of stop themselves doing that stop themselves from having a Mystic Mine, stop themselves from sort of having to deal with their opponent's monsters for an indefinite period of time. I do think that's unfair, and I do think that does create kind of unhealthy game sets that just aren't really good for us in the long run. But again, like I said before, I still do think Mystic Mine is needed for the format. I think it's a necessary evil. It's a good answer to a lot of the unfair combo decks that we see. And I think as well, it really forces you to deck build in a different way. I mean, it hasn't had the effect, unfortunately, but that's less down to the card and it's more just down to mentality. Everyone builds decks, and DP Yugioh said this, and I thought it was such a good point. Everyone has these decks which are just combo pieces. It's just full of combo pieces and monsters designed to building up those unbeatable boards. Well, if your deck is like that, and the thing is, you can say that's fun, but it's not fun for everyone. It's not fun for the person who lost the die roll. So if there's a card that punishes you for doing that, I mean, is that really unfair? I mean, if you go back at like 5-10 years ago, and I've actually done this, I went back on Yugioh Pro top decks, and you look at some of the decks from 5-10 years ago, they would have traps and back row removal in the main deck very often, because that's just how it was. You played a lot more utility before. Nowadays, people don't play utility, which is why Mystic Mine feels so busted. I guarantee you, if you go back to 2008 and you play Mystic Mine, I don't see you dominating a format or anything. I'm not saying it's not going to be a good card, but half the time it's just going to get popped off the field because your opponent probably wasn't going to have more than one monster anyway, and they're going to have a bunch of utility in their deck. So I really do think it's more about the state of Yugioh, and it's more about this kind of really combo-centric, spammy monster deck that allows Mystic Mine to be so strong. It's just the format. It's the same reason why it's the same thing as Necro Valley. Necro Valley is busted, but only in certain formats. But yeah, so guys, that is my opinion on Mystic Mine. Yeah, I think it's a fair card. I think it should exist. I think it does have problems. It is unfair, not unfair, sorry, it is unfun to play against. It is frustrating to deal with, but it does really address the current state and issue with Yu-Gi-Oh. So yeah, that is my opinion on Mystic Mine. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will talk to you all soon.